I wanted to ask you, or really important one for me, because I work in the newsroom. What is the mood in your newsrooms now, Lenore?
Cautiously hopeful, I think. I think we're all sort of struggling with the same disruptions, and we're all finding our different ways through it. At The Guardian, commercially, that's through a combination of ad revenue and voluntary contributions. It's about 50-50 at the moment.
And your journalists believe that that Guardian model is sustainable?
Yeah, we think it is. You know, we've never actually said we'd never ever introduce a paywall if it one day proved not to be, but it looks very much like it is. And while we can keep our journalism open to everybody and still make profits, which we have done for the last 2 years, then that seems to be the ideal way to go. And both of those revenue streams are looking quite reasonable at the moment.
James, you've just had this huge takeover of Nine. How are you going over there?
I'd use the same phrase as Lenore. I think we're cautiously optimistic. We've had a pretty amazing year financially for my part of the business, and you know the print revenue, the decline in print revenues has basically stopped. We're focusing a lot more on subscribers, and we're getting growth there. And
what stopped it? What stopped the decline, do you think?
In print? I think there were arguably a few mistakes made at the old Fairfax a few years ago in some of the messaging about print, so we've been a bit more aggressive there. We've put a bit lower love into the newspapers, which the advertisers recognise, and I think the markets probably recognise that for certain categories, and I'm not an expert on this, but you get a lot better bang for your buck with print than you do perhaps with Facebook and some of the other platforms. So all those factors have combined, I think, to make it a slightly healthier environment for us.
Kate, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we're a profitable business at news.com.au. We're growing every year. I certainly think there's a future for free online news, as well as we obviously have a lot of subscriber businesses within News Corp. In terms of our newsroom, they're very hopeful. There are a lot of young journalists. They're highly skilled in ways that perhaps some people in traditional media are not. They know how to do a range of things that I think will lead them on to jobs you know, in the next 5 and 10 years. So they're very hopeful. It's expanding part of the business.
Anthony?
Yeah, look, I think our newsrooms. I mean, look, I'm quite bullish about the future of our newsroom and the future of the industry. I mean, I'm sort of like a broken record where I say I can't imagine there was ever been a better time to be a journalist. You know, we're in this sort of age now where we can get a document leaked to us, and instead of just cherry picking quotes, we can do a front page story, a spread, and then put the entire document up online and ask our readers to tell us what we've missed.
You worried about going to jail?
Not more so than I have ever been as a journalist. I mean, I think the press freedom stuff, obviously, it was mentioned earlier that, you know, press freedom is the bedrock of our society. I think one thing we probably don't talk enough about, well, probably two things we don't talk enough about, is that I think journos will find a way. I mean, there's always a way to get a source to give you something. And secondly, when we talk about press freedom, you know, I'm also bullish on the fact that we should be talking about defamation law as well. I mean, when what I do, defamation law is the greatest hindrance to my team's reporting.
Lenore, jump in. Everybody jump in, please.
Yeah, I just concur with that. Defamation law is, you know, the biggest daily problem.
James, one of the sort of different challenges, I suppose, in the last few years that papers have had to wrestle with, editors have had to wrestle with, is continuous news versus that sort of daily appointment viewing. Are we getting it right, do you think, in journalism?
I can only speak for ourselves, but I think we are. I think we've gone from a sort of a very reach-focused approach at the Herald and the Age to a more subscriber-based focus, and that means a couple of things. It means that there's a consistency across the print and the online kind of platforms that perhaps wasn't there before, and a similarity in quality. It also means you can probably slow down a bit on the online side of things and once again focus more on quality, because that's what we found our subscribers want. They're not coming to us and paying for us for, you know, commoditised news, and there's definitely a place for that, and there's definitely a value that can be attached to that. But they're coming to us for, you know, news they can't get elsewhere, analysis they can't get out elsewhere, journalists they can't get elsewhere. So if you focus on that and you deliver that in the appropriate way and at the appropriate times, the newsroom doesn't have to be as frantic as it was in the past.
Yeah, subscription journalism, and it is really refreshing, I find, for a newsroom. When you look at the data, you know, what it clearly tells you is 2 or 3 really good deep dive investigations are what, you know, bring you subscriptions. And so you go from like a scattergun approach, basically trying to get as many clicks as possible, to going, okay, so what are we going to focus on? And what's our long-term project? And, you know, we've started calling it event journalism at the West, where we try to, you know, we tell ourselves, okay, what's our 4-part series that we're going to launch in 3 weeks' time? And when we launch that series, how do we launch it in the same way that Netflix might launch a new show? So, you know, we take out TV advertising, we take out posters, we do big full-page house ads, and the effect's been really good.
Kate, yeah.
I think what data's done for us, though, it's not just about clicks, although obviously we're a free online site. Reach is very important to us. It's about understanding what the reader wants. And I think that's been a bit of a bubble for journalism in the past. We've, as editors and reporters, assumed we've always known what our readers want. And of course, you have to make editorial choices. You have to reach forward and take something to a reader. But at the same time, if readers are consistently telling you through the use of analytics and data that they're not interested in something, you either need to change your way of intriguing them or trying to get them into that subject, or realise that it's not of interest to them. I think there can be arrogance in journalism still that doesn't take into account the readers are telling you very clearly what they like and don't like. We did a story about a faulty family who bought a faulty Jeep the other day, did about 350,000 page views in less than 24 hours. Does that mean we just write stories about Jeeps? No, but it tells you some of the sore spots or soft spots of what your readers are interested in.
I don't disagree with that, but I do think that we've got to be cautious and careful and thoughtful about how we use analytics. Yes, it's true that particularly if we're focusing on subscriptions, or in our case voluntary donations, that aligns the commercial objective and the editorial objectives much more than if we're really just going after advertising. That's true. But both the analytics of page views and the analytics of engagement, I think we need to use quite carefully, because it doesn't mean that those commercial objectives and the editorial objectives are exactly the same. For instance, I don't think writing something that challenges your readers or writing something that they might disagree with is going to drive subscriptions, or in our case, voluntary donations. But that's still got to be part of what we do. We can't just feed people what they want to hear or what they already agree with. I think we've got to use analytics and use data carefully to make sure we're still delivering on our journalistic purpose, but also listening to what our readers want and what they're saying.
And agreed. You have to do it. You can't just follow the reader, because you might end up in a bubble. But what worries me more is the other bubble, where we ignore what Australians are telling you about their interests, their passion points, the things that hurt them, because we live in a journalistic world where we've determined what's important. And I do still see examples of journalism where it's written for a newsroom and it's maybe written for other newsrooms. It's not necessarily written for the readers. And I think some of that's purely just about changing the way we do our business. It's not necessarily about changing our journalistic integrity. It's not about doing stories that matter less, by no means. But I think it's about doing things differently.
Do you think we're having a bit more of an adult conversation about this now than perhaps we might have been 4 or 5 years ago, when those marketing departments at media companies were sort of swelling up and everybody was after clicks, and quite senior people on the editorial front were, frankly, I would say, a little bit overwhelmed with some of the analysis coming forward? Do you think that pendulum has swung out and we're now actually in a better place to be a little bit more, have a little bit more scrutiny over some of this, and that's why perhaps we're in a better place now, James?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you look at the mastheads around the world that have done well in recent years, it's those ones where their readers have a strong relationship with them, and they feel like those mastheads stand for something. And some of that comes from understanding the readers, but it's also, there's an element of curation there, and I do agree with Lenore. We probably wouldn't have done the Ben Roberts-Smith stories if we were just doing, if we were looking at it for financial reasons or defamation and all that kind of stuff. It's a controversial story, and quite a few of our readers are not wild about it. But I think at the end of the day, they appreciate journalism that's going to challenge them, and we like to think our readers, and I'm sure everyone else would agree, don't want to be told what to think. And so, I remember 5-6 years ago, people were telling me confidently that editors, the role of the editor will be redundant in the future. And I think,
how did you feel about that?
This is the most self-serving thing I will ever say, and that is saying something. But I think it's probably more important than ever, because you have a lot of tools at your disposal, but you've also got to, with your team, have something that people can relate to, and that's a human judgment there.
Yeah,
I agree. There's, we talk a lot about, AI and robotics, and hopefully there will be a robot that comes into our newsroom and serves us tea and biscuits. That would be lovely. And I think that there will be a place for AI, and certainly in some sort of standardised reporting. But I don't think that that's ever going to replace the innate curiosity, the investigations that take place in journalism, and I agree completely about curation and editing. It's an important process, but I would, I guess, see it as a little bit more of a dance than it used to be.
I think that's very well.
It was very one-sided, and I guess what I'm saying now is you need to kind of mutually kind of waltz your way around the dance floor with the reader, rather than just.
I think that's very well put, Kate. It's interesting that again, from Scott Galloway this morning, we had, AI is fine, but the human factor is now becoming so important. In our CMO panel, they were talking about the sort of hollowing out of your brand if you do too much listening to, the sort of click feedback. I mean, is that your view, Anthony?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think, probably the elephant in the room is social media and Twitter and the echo chamber of Twitter. And newsrooms in particular. I mean, I look at my younger reporters, and unless you get them sometimes and say, get out of the office, go to the suburbs, go to the shopping centre in the middle of nowhere and talk to people, they will literally spend their entire day on Twitter looking for yarns, thinking that that's the real Australia. And
do your young journalists pick up the phone? Or do they need to be encouraged to pick up the phone? It's like everything's online. Yeah?
Definitely need to be encouraged to pick up the phone. And like I said, they need to be encouraged to get out of the office. I mean, we're really proud. I mean, so I'm the senior editor of West Australian newspapers. We have 19 regional papers and 12 community papers. And so we're really proud of the fact that we're starting to really integrate those papers back into the Metro newsroom. And so you can pick up my newspaper now, and every day it's sort of littered with sort of bylines and then a little masthead underneath saying, Broome Advertiser or Kalgoorlie Miner. But there is definitely a threat, I think, in newsrooms of it becoming too city-focused, too social media-based, and basically journalists talking to themselves instead of talking to real Australians.
What is interesting, though, is about those young people who, I agree, can be very desk-bound by nature of their job and perhaps their age. We've had some experiences at News Corp where we send our young digital reporter down to Adelaide Advertiser and vice versa. And there's a great exchange of skills that I think is happening there as well, where, young journalists who do know a lot about sourcing information via, technology are able to sort of show that to journalists who are able to sort of say, well, here's what you can do with a bit of nous as well. So I think there's a lot to be learned still.
Another thing that was raised today, which slightly horrified me, was the idea that a large amount of free advertising is now being taken advantage of by big business, big companies, in terms of the media release, which is just literally rerun almost word for word in a lot of media outlets. Now, I'm sitting here with the absolute pick of really traditional and current media in terms of top quality media. How much of that do you think happens in our media? And are we shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of attracting advertising, if that's the case?
I think a tiny, tiny proportion of our journalism would be driven by media releases. I don't find them particularly useful usually. I don't really want to commission according to the agenda of some external body. I want to commission according to our agenda and what we think is important. The only thing more annoying than getting the same media release 10 times in your inbox is when they then call and make sure that you've got it.
Not good.
So media releases are not an important part of what we do.
Yeah.
I feel, I don't, a sort of slightly different role, but even when I was still reporting towards the end, I just felt a sort of sense of sadness when a media release would come into my inbox, because I would just think whoever's trying to push this story has failed.
It's just wasted their time.
It is, and I think they're becoming less and less relevant.
But if that's the case, then is that wrong, that actually there's not as much free advertising going out as...
I remember in print, working at the Daily Telly when I was young, a lot of papers were powered by PRs. It was the way that people got their message across. It wasn't necessarily, it was all about free advertising, but that was the world we lived in. So I actually think it's less. I don't think most of my reporters don't look at press releases. I don't know how they're getting their message across through influencers, through Instagram and through Facebook. And as you said, people who are spruiking that message in a different way, but press releases.
Nothing personally annoys me more as somebody who interviews CEOs a lot than, on the annual results of a big company, they will have already by the morning, usually some freelance journalist having interviewed the CEO, and it's online on their website for all to see. And it's obviously a sort of Dorothy Dix.
Asking quite different questions.
Of course, yeah. But this is something quite new within company that happens. But one hopes by the time it gets to us, there's a slightly different.
Well, I guess they're trying to do what politicians have tried to do for a long time, and just kind of circumvent actual working journalists. And it's up to us to make sure that circumvention doesn't work.
It's an interesting space in the sporting world, actually.
Yeah, they do their own.
All of our, which we're all fighting against to a degree, but. The sporting code that has their own media outlet, does their own media interviews, cuts off access to players. But again, the thing I love, and I'm a broken record about paywall, but the thing I love about digital subscriptions to a degree is that, a press release is not going to sell us a subscription. And so it really does focus the newsroom on going deeper and digging and looking at what doesn't want to get told. Because what we've found is that that's what sells subscriptions.
What about co-pros? What about different media organisations coming together on big investigations? Do we think this is progress? Like Crown or, the...
Well, that was the one media organisation.
Yeah. One media, sorry. What am I thinking of? Various ones that have won Walkley Awards.
But I think it's...
Commonwealth Bank, for example.
It's happened a lot in the past, and I think that for Nine, I guess it'll be more of your collaboration between your TV networks and your print. We do a lot of collaboration at News Corp. We're a very big company. We collaborate with Foxtel. News.com collaborated with Sky News during the election. News.com.au collaborated with the Hobart Mercury around rape laws in Tasmania. So potentially and I would say that our collaboration around press freedom is also pretty amazing.
That's a collaboration. The Right to Know Coalition is a collaboration across all organisations about issues that are important. So that's a...
But say ABC and Fairfax or ABC and Nine.
Well, we're on the record saying we're still going to collaborate with the ABC. It's not... The collaborations, the journos like the collaborations not because they're doing something with another media organisation necessarily, it's because it amplifies the story. So if you have a good yarn and it's in a newspaper on Saturday morning, it then goes up on the website, and then Monday night or Sunday night, depending on the channel, it's on television, more and more people will see the story will have more impact. It's not much more complicated
And I think
than that.
increasingly we're going to have to think that way as we struggle to tell the sorts of stories that we used to be able to tell when newsrooms were a lot bigger. Collaboration is going to be a really useful tool to do that. I know the successful pitch we made to the Judith Neilson Institute involved setting up a collaborative group of Pacific journalists to work with our Pacific editor, tell Pacific stories, because there's no other way that we could, possibly cover that ground as one organisation. So I actually think collaboration is going to be one of the tools that we use to kind of fill in the gaps as media organisations have gotten smaller, as newsrooms have gotten smaller.
Now, what about collaborating with Facebook and Google?
Well, we do that already.
Yeah.
We give them our content.
Yeah. That's what I mean. I mean, that's new, isn't it?
Well, it's an uneasy alliance, friendship, whatever you want to call it, frenemies.
Yes. Do you see more and more of it happening? Because I mean, we've gone from a couple of years ago being totally siloed from each other, now to looking at possibly what's beneficial for both sides, what we can work with.
Well, I think that it's mostly beneficial for them. So it really, for us, is about clawing back a little bit of that power around our own content. And that's been one of the biggest changes that's occurred for us, obviously, is that, I mean, as the Minister said, we're still creating all the content. We're still creating the good content. It's still coming out of traditional newsrooms, but it's being distributed by someone else. It's no longer just on the back of the truck or coming across on the 6 o'clock news. Now we've got to rely on some other pretty big players to distribute that content, and I don't think that's going to get any easier until we make some changes.
But I guess what is still happening is that traditional media, if you will, is still producing the content. So I this year am on 3-minute little Facebook things, which is just amazing for me because I'm not on Facebook. So, but that is quite a new thing. But it's still, that content is still being produced by Sky News, as opposed to, say, Apple starting to produce its content, in a really, really major way. So presumably that's what we've got to cling on to on the traditional media side. James?
I didn't quite understand what you were saying then, but
well,
I think you just got to be. I think you've got to go into it with a reasonably open mind. I don't sort of subscribe to the News Corpian black and white view of Google and Facebook. I think there are some things to like about them, and there's a lot of things not to like about them. But
so what is to like about them?
Well, I don't know. Like the Google people, they've got some. They pay people, and there's a political element to this. But they pay people to work with news organisations on projects, and they've got a lot of good technology, and sometimes that's quite helpful in the way you present your story. And if they're offering that up, I don't see the point in sort of saying no. We've done and this is not my area. We've done a sort of a commercial deal with Google, which is sort of seeing how the two companies can work together. And I think it's good to, there's got to be experimentation in all aspects of media at the moment. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. But if you close yourself off from it completely, I think you're probably going to do yourself some damage.
Yeah. Okay. I guess what we were saying is that the issue is where the ad streams are going and the market power there, obviously, which I think is at the centre of all this.
Yeah.
But it's about where that content production is happening, I suppose, was the point I was making.
But I think we're also our own worst enemies, and we have been for a long time, where we've talked down, in particular, newspapers. Like our industry, the newspaper industry, more than any industry, has probably talked down newspapers. And what we've found, and you talk to advertisers, is that Facebook and social media did a very good job of saying how powerful they are. Well, at the end of the day, 400,000 West Australians read the newspaper every day. I can see the data and the analytics on the posts we put up on Facebook, and some of them only reach 5,000 people. And I think that's the shift that also needs to happen, is we need to start talking ourselves up again, stop talking ourselves down. I mean, how many times have you seen headlines in newspapers literally talking about the end of newspapers? You sort of see that stuff and you think, well, no other industry does
But
that.
surely at the heart of this, it comes back to this issue around trust and quality journalism. The point I was making about the press release just going out into the ether there, I'm sure there are plenty of press releases floating around in social media, but it comes back to talking up what is quality journalism.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the future of journalism really depends on the decisions that we take now, that the decision to hold fast to kind of purpose-driven journalism, journalism of accountability, that kind of work, not to allow ourselves to be polarised, not to allow ourselves to sort of turn into filter bubbles that never disconnect and never really kind of hold the public square. And I think if we do that and we maintain the trust relationship with our readers and we explain to our readers why we do what we do and why it's important, and we make that case to politicians, and it was really sort of gratifying to hear the Minister today reiterate the purpose of journalism. If we can make that case publicly and live it and do it, then I think the future is quite bright. If we allow ourselves to be sort of pushed out to extremes and to not continue to make that case, then I think we could be in real trouble.
And sorry to interrupt, but the trust thing's really interesting because I often come across people and the media's completely, it's dropped the ball and all that kind of stuff. And they talk about the media in general, and then you sort of say, oh, well, what do you think about The Age? And they'll go, oh, I quite like The Age. And what do you think about Adele Ferguson? And I'm sure, Lenore, you have it with Catherine Murphy and The Guardian, and Adele Ferguson, she's terrific. So it's. I think it's a little bit more. You constantly look at things saying trust in media is falling, and I think there's obviously some truth to that. But it's certain types of media, and it's people's perceptions of media. When you drill down to it, it's much more complicated.
But I feel
it's like the young person question, though, right? So the whole idea that young people don't read newspapers and young people don't read the news. Well, when I was young, I didn't read newspapers either because I had better things to do with my life. I was too busy partying.
But does it come down? I mean, I could
the question. It's about the same thing about trust. People don't trust the media. Well, when you talk to them, they do.
I would agree. I don't think that. When I was a young journalist, I remember looking at the list of where journalists were trusted professions, and it was right down there with used car salesmen. It's always been the way that people are like, oh, journos. But in the end, they do trust us, and I agree completely. They will look at trusted brands, and I think we have the trust. What we don't have is their attention, and that's what we need to fight for. But it's a crowded world. It's a crowded market in terms of attention. And time. And the right to a reader... you don't have a right to a reader. You need to find that reader. You need to go out and chase them. And I think that's where we've been sort of, those have been the difficulties with Google and Facebook, is that they've taken a share of our eyeballs. I don't think the trust has disappeared.
I think we have to stand our ground and make sure that that trust isn't eroded. I mean, there are politicians, thankfully not the Minister today, but politicians, the President of America is one of them, who uses the word fake news and fake news media, and is actually, quite overtly trying to undermine trust and credibility of our profession and our institutions. And I think we have to be quite conscious of that. And, I don't think we should ever use the term fake news, because if it's fake, it's not news. We have to I think we do have to stand up to that to maintain the trust and the credibility of what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are two conversations. One definitely about trust, and then the second one, which I like that you're raising, Kate, is that idea of fighting for our readership. I mean, I am very big on the fact that our competition isn't just other media outlets. Our competition is Netflix. Our competition is Instagram. Our competition is time. People are so time poor.
But to come back to the brand again, which is where our power is. Now, you both mentioned journalists. I mean, I could mention, Paul Kelly or a John Jury. I mean, these are names that people gravitate to because they want the analysis. They want what they see as really, thought-leading commentary. And I guess that as editors continues to be enormously important for you to have those thought leaders on your teams, yeah?
Yeah, you need people who have credibility and assess things thoughtfully and factually and independently, and that's the most precious commodity that you have.
What did you think of the Minister's views on freedom of information today? Tried my hardest.
Yeah, but we didn't get very far.
Where do you think he's sitting? I mean, to me, it doesn't feel like he wants to create more of a danger zone than exists at the moment. Would that be fair? Or?
I couldn't really get a read. I thought he was very good at not giving us much of a read on what he was going to take to Cabinet, to be honest.
I agree.
How much influence do you think he'll have in Cabinet?
I think it's a pretty well-established truth in Canberra that the media portfolio is shared between the Minister for Communications and the Prime Minister. So it'll be an interesting discussion.
Okay. What about the digital platforms? Were you surprised, as I was, that Scott Galloway literally had never heard of the review here?
I mean, I think the ACCC has been quite active internationally in talking about it. So, yeah.
I think it's big in the regulatory world.
Big in the regulatory world?
Yeah, and regulators, I mean, regulators spend a lot of time looking at what other regulators are doing. So I think when the government, the ACCC, talks about this being a bit of a leading indicator, they're right, but whether that's permeated into sort of more less elevated circles, I'm not sure.
Looking at the media rooms of the future, when you guys look for new journalists to bring in on your team, where are you sourcing now, apart from each other, obviously?
I think that's a really big and difficult question. I mean, sometimes when we put out job ads, I look at the applications and think, I never knew there were so many well-educated former editors of On Histoire. You know, there are very, very well-qualified young applicants for those sort of entry-level jobs, but they're very much the same. So one of the great challenges we have is getting a diversity of candidates, and I think having a diversity in the newsroom, like not just ethnic diversity, but socioeconomic diversity, is really important to be able to tell the right stories and understand the world, understand what we're looking at, but it's a really hard thing to do. I think it's also really important to source a range of skills, like we need data skills, we need a whole lot of other skills that probably when I was applying for jobs weren't even thought of. So I think it's quite challenging, despite the fact that journalism schools are, you know, producing thousands of candidates every day.
What do you look for?
Quite honestly, I look for someone who's really keen, smart, and not a dickhead. And I think the rest we teach them. I think, you know, a sub-editor said to me when I was a young journalist, and I was saying, I don't know what I was saying something stupid. She said, journalism's not a career, it's a trade, love. I guess what I'm saying is journalism is a trade. It's a learned skill. It's something you work at. It's a craft. You get better at it. And the best journalists are inquisitive, you know, so they're always asking questions. They're always thinking. And there's some who are never going to be great writers, but they're great reporters. So essentially, I look at their resumes. I have a look what they've done. It's great if they've got certain skills, some data skills or some video skills, but in the end, they pick stuff up quickly if they're really keen. I really, really want them to work in my newsroom, if they really, really want to work there, and they're smart, and as I said, not a dickhead, they're probably in.
I would...
yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry.
James, go ahead.
Just to go back to the point about using the telephone that was mentioned earlier, like... We did trainees about it. It's almost a year ago, and I'm not for a minute diminishing the importance of data journalism. But every second person, a lot of them former On Histoire editors.
There's so many of them.
There are a lot. Since 80 a year or something. A lot of them, maybe 50%, talked about how they wanted to be a data journalist. And once again, I felt that feeling of sadness that I get when a press release comes into my inbox, because I wanted people to sort of bounce off Kate. I want people who want to hit the phones and talk to people. I think data is really important, but it can be taught. And getting on the phone doesn't mean you're going to be a crime reporter or a sports reporter. You know, Paul Kelly is on the phone. Peter Harch is on the phone. I'm sure Catherine Murphy, I don't know her, I'm sure she's on the phone. All the good The journalists I love in my newsroom are the ones, every time I go over to their desk to try and talk to them about something,
They're
I
on the
can't
phone.
get to them because they're on the phone. So it goes back to that point about being keen and a little bit paranoid that if you don't make that one last phone call, maybe your idea or your story won't be as good as the opposition.
Yeah. Anthony?
My mentor when I was young said to me, journalism's not a job, it's a vocation. And I really sincerely believe that. It's such a random thing that we do that you live and breathe 24/7, and unless you're really passionate about it, I think it's hard to get going. The other thing I think that we don't talk about enough in the industry is that sort of crisis of the late 20-year-old, early 30-year-old that gets out of journalism and for whatever reason becomes a little bit cynical, probably struggling to get a pay rise because of what's been happening recently, and how do we hold on to those people? Like, I've probably seen too many of my contemporaries who are very good at what they do, even Walkley Award winners sort of leave. And so I'm very big on also how do we, it's one thing to get them in the newsroom, it's another thing to keep them in the newsroom, keep them excited and keep them passionate.
How do you do that?
Look, I think it's about rewarding rewarding what they're interested in. Like I said, we're coming back to this idea of event journalism a lot in my newsroom and actually backing them in and saying to them, take a month to look into something. I'll figure out the newspaper every day. There's enough stories in the world to go around. If you need to take 6 weeks to look into something, go for it. We had a brilliant young reporter called Annabelle Hennessy who's done an amazing piece about, an Aboriginal woman in the north of the state who's languishing in jail because she was a domestic violence victim. On one night, he was going to kill her, but she killed him first, and now she's in prison. She spent 6 weeks on that, and I'm really proud of the fact that we let her do that and didn't ask her every day, hey, have you got something for the news list?
I think that's definitely the biggest change. We run a mass free website. Our reporters sometimes write 5 stories a day.
Yeah.
They do get on the phone, but not always. But, it wasn't unusual in the days of print to spend all week on one story, if it was important enough. And I think that is one of the sad parts about the shrinking and contracting newsrooms and the speed with which we work is not always being able to give people the time to, take 2 weeks, 6 weeks to spend on an important story, because you do need time.
But on a digital site, you can make your choices. We've probably got a smaller newsroom than the other people on this panel, but I can still make sure that people have weeks or months on big stories, and if that means that we have to sort of suck up the news on a particular thing in a live blog rather than doing 4 or 5 stories like we might have once, well then that's the trade-off that you make. But I agree with Anthony that we really, the most important thing, both in terms of journalism and in terms of reader revenue, is doing the big, deep investigations or the big projects that really get noticed.
Yeah.
So what about the use of video within online media? Because I don't think that's moved very fast.
But I think it should. And News Corp, there's some of the big wigs from News Corp in the room, which is good. But they'll talk about Voodoo Medics, which was, a 6 or 7 part sort of, video documentary series that we commissioned when I was at the Daily Telegraph as the deputy editor. And it was successful, very successful for subscriptions. I think video journalism in several parts is a really strong way of looking for digital subscriptions.
But it's shifted, right? So even a few years ago, a lot of the emphasis was on, really short videos that you can run ads against.
Little ads at the top that nobody watched and everybody moved on.
In Guardian UK, they now have a video department that commissions sort of 10, 15, 20-minute videos, and one of them was just nominated last year for an Oscar. So and we run them sort of in banners across the site, and they get really a lot of views, and they're really in-depth, good productions.
Well, I think Voodoo Medics, I'm going to get the name of the festival wrong, but I think it got nominated at LA Film Festival, LA Documentary Festival or something. I think that's really where they should be looking. And it makes sense. There's no reason a print journo can't be a multimedia journo, can't be a documentarian.
It's time-consuming.
Time-consuming, yes.
It
and
can
expensive.
be. I think not that I'm a futurist, but I think 5G will be interesting when we're up and running. I think that will probably mean there's more of an ability to stream back from events, that people will be able to do that, and it'll be quicker. So I think we've had mixed messages around video. You know, people still go out and they stand in front of the camera and they introduce, I'm here to talk to you about, it's like, I'm gone. Just show me the subject matter. So I think as reporters, print reporters, if we'll become better at making video that's interesting to our readers, I think we do start to combat some of the traditional broadcasters in that area. And I agree with Lenore that need for sort of more long form is there. But again, I'd always want to look at the metrics, because sometimes people do jump up and down about, I'm not looking at you, or I don't know your metrics around different things, but I'm saying that I hear people talk about things that they've done and they say it did really well, and sometimes when you look at the views, they weren't there. So always, if you're going to be doing something, you want to make sure that you do have an audience, because otherwise, if no one saw it.
And it is interesting how you do it. I mean, you say you don't want someone saying, well, here we are and I'm here to talk about, but you go on every blog that is so beckoning that everybody watches that, and they all start with, hi, I'm here to talk about blah, blah. But as you say, when you're looking at a piece, it's got to be really...
Or in
your face, doesn't it? It's
or
got
in
to really add value.
multimedia package, you can have someone who you've interviewed telling their story straight to camera, and that can be a powerful integrated part of the multimedia package.
And what about you, James? Because I mean, again, you've got the opportunity with Nine now to link things through more.
Yeah, I mean, we have a sort of a veritable fire hose now coming, but it's commoditised video, broadly speaking, a good quality commoditised video, and sometimes that'll work really well. You might have a match report or analysis piece about the state of origin, and you've got a highlights package, and they complement each other really well.
But sport really leads the way on this, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And you can do, and people are probably in our newsroom where we're doing more creative stuff, it's often on the sports side if you've got the rights. But I think I would agree that for our team, and we have a small video team and they work with the audio team, and there's a similar kind of argument to have, I think, about podcasts and where that delivers value, but it's doing that kind of bespoke stuff. It's probably not, we've probably moved on from sort of thinking we're going to monetize the hell out of it. It's probably more something to do with our brand, and it speaks to our brand values rather than just a financial proposition.
Or finding another way to tell the same story that might be appealing to a different audience. So same journalism, same investigation, same story. You tell it by pod, you tell it online. Yeah. You get new audiences for it.
It's also about the metrics too. I mean, like, what are you doing that video for? Like, are you doing a true crime documentary series to get subscriptions? That's great. Yeah. You can look at that and you can say, well, this works because we spent this much money and we've made this much revenue from subscriptions. Yeah. But then you also have to think about loyalty. Like, are you doing this particular... So they've signed up for one true crime doco. Well, what's your next true crime doco so the churn rate isn't high? I mean, we talk about, the thing I love about metrics at the moment is we're starting to talk about time on site and we're starting to talk about churn rates. They're the really interesting metrics for me, because we're suddenly going, well, it's not enough to just get them. You've got to get them and hold them.
What about podcasts? I mean, podcasts certainly, well, Kate.
Well, I mean, the Teacher's Pet was a massive success in terms of readership for the Australian, but I think it's absolutely crucial, as James said, to be saying why. Why are we doing it? Because, people go, I want to do a podcast and I want to tell a story. And it's like, that's fine. But what's the value for your newsroom? Is it brand? Is it just a branding exercise because you've got a readership that you haven't commercialised? I think you need to ask yourself that question. Podcasts have been the big hope. Everyone will tell you that, readers want them and advertisers want them, but I'm not 100% convinced, which doesn't mean that I'm not a fan of podcasts. It just means that I think, again, in the media, in the state of play where we are, you need to ask yourself hard questions. Why? Why are we doing it? What is the value? And if you can convince yourself of the value, but don't just do it in your newsroom bubble.
And podcasting's hard because you have to host it on a free website. So, you host it on a platform that's free. So then you go, okay, it's about brand, which is fantastic. Then it's about advertising. The problem being, Teacher's Pet, first of all, is amazing. So the standard's pretty high. And secondly, it's true crime. Like, how do you sit in a room with an advertiser and say, hey, we've got this story about this murder that we're trying to solve. Do you want to get your ad to pop up on it? And I mean, we had a very successful podcast about the Claremont serial killer case, and the truth is we went to a whole bunch of advertisers and we just couldn't convince them that it was worth it because they were so worried about the brand association.
So we're about to expand more into podcasting, and the reason why is that, we've been in Australia for 6 years. I think we've done really well, 5 million uniques a month, that's great. But we need to find new audiences for the journalism that we're already doing. So telling the same stories but via podcast is aiming to find new audiences for them.
And I think it'll get more sophisticated. You see with some of the US podcasts now, they'll be a little bit more selective about what episodes you can get if you're not a subscriber, if you can, and you can if you are a subscriber.
Yeah.
But I think the advertising, I agree with Anthony, advertising return on investment is pretty low. So it is all about reaching those new audiences. Like everyone in my newsroom wants to do a podcast. Nobody wants to do a newsletter, and it's just there's so much research that says newsletters are much more valuable when it comes to converting people into subscribers. So it's a very sexy thing, podcasting at the moment, but I think we're still working it out.
So in the couple of minutes we've got left, one thing perhaps I could ask James first, as a former London European correspondent,
Brexit is going well. Yeah.
Brexit is going really well.
Yeah.
I can see
work it
with
out,
hands there. But Boris Johnson, Brexit, Donald Trump, foreign trade, has that changed the balance in terms of what people are looking for here in coverage in your papers, in your Australian papers? Are you doing a lot more just because the stories are so exciting now?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at I'm sort of a data nerd when it comes to the audience, and especially even the newspaper audience. And recently I did an audit, so I've been editing the West since January 1st, and I did an audit of when I see spikes in the newspaper, and there's a couple of trends that I noticed, and I swear one of the trends I noticed, anytime I put Donald Trump on the front page, paper sales go up.
Mm-hmm. And we, of course, have the enormous advantage of having a US Guardian and the UK Guardian, and those stories do really well.
Well, I would say that the European or UK correspondent for the Herald and the Age used to sort of be the slightly sleepier one, and that was certainly hoping that would be the case when I headed over. But I arrived when the Scottish referendum was taking place, and that was a bit more exciting. Everyone expected, and then there was the Cameron election victory, and then there was Brexit, and there were UK terrorist attacks, and all of a sudden Europe's, I think, become as a news story a lot more interesting to people. And I think we talk about what's important for readers, and having foreign correspondents. If you're the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, it's really important. People expect you to have journalists on the ground in these parts of the world, even though they can log on to the Guardian or the New York Times. They get very upset if you don't have someone there telling stories. And it's not just to get Australian angles on things that happen overseas. They want Australians sort of explaining it to them in certain ways as well. So it's a really integral part of the masthead.
Very interesting. Right, ladies, gents, it's been great to have all you editor-in-chiefs on the floor. So thank you very much to our